In the autumn of 1887, on the fringes of what was then still considered the respectable outskirts of London, where the gas lights thinned and the cobbles gave way to gravel drives flanked by skeletal oak, stood Blackthorn Manor, a red brick relic of late Georgian ambition. Its windows shuttered more often than not, its gardens overgrown with ivy that crept like fingers toward the eaves. The house belonged to the Wellinghams, a name once whispered among the corridors of Parliament and the drawing rooms of Mayfair, though by that year only the eldest son, Alistair Wellingham, remained in residence, having returned from his diplomatic post in Constantinople under circumstances never publicly disclosed but privately speculated upon with increasing unease. Alistair was known before his reclusiveness took hold as a man of polished manners and refined intellect, fluent in 3 languages, a patron of the Royal Academy, and according to his Oxford tutors possessed of a mind to attune to the unseen. His letters from abroad, preserved in the archives of the British Library through a bequest of unknown provenance, betray a growing fixation with what he termed the architecture of silence, not mere absence of sound, but a presence shaped by omission, by intervals between words, by the weight of what is left unsaid. Neighbors recalled how upon his return he would walk the perimeter of his estate at dusk, not with a dog or a servant, but alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the horizon as though expecting something or someone to emerge from the gathering fog. Fog, in those parts, was not merely meteorological, it was a character in its own right, thick with coal smoke and river damp, capable of swallowing carriages whole and muffling church bells until they sounded like distant moans. It was within this fog that deliveries began to arrive at Blackthorn in marked crates, carried by men who refused payment in coin, accepting only sealed envelopes handed through a slit in the gate. The local postmistress, Mrs. Eliza Crompton, noted in her diary now held in the Surrey County Archives that the Wellingham post was never addressed in ink, but in a greyish wash that smelled faintly of camphor and burnt rosemary. More curious still was the matter of the music. Several residents of the nearby hamlet of Lower Farnley reported in affidavits collected by the parish clerk in 1889 that on certain nights always, when the moon hung low and veiled, they heard singing from the direction of Blackthorn, not the kind of drawing-room arias expected of a gentleman's household, but a low polyphonic hum, harmonized in thirds and fifths, that seemed to shift just beyond the threshold of comprehension, like plain songs sung backward or through water. One farmhand, Jacob Pike, swore he had seen candles burning in the east wing long after the household had been declared empty by the coroner. He described the light as not yellow nor white, but a sickly violet, the color of bruises beneath skin. The Wellinghams had long employed only a single housekeeper, an elderly woman named Agnes Mallow, who had served the family since before Alistair's birth. She was rarely seen after 1886, though her silhouette was occasionally glimpsed at an upper window, motionless hands folded in her lap, staring not outward but downward as if watching something unfold in the courtyard, below that no one else could perceive. When questioned by the rector of St. Etheldredus, she murmured only, "He is listening now. He has always been listening," before retreating into a silence from which she never emerged. Alistair himself gave no interviews, accepted no callers, and when the tax assessors came in the spring of 1888, they found the front door ajar, the floors polished to a mirror sheen, the furniture draped in Holland covers dusted with a fine silver powder that clung to the skin and left a metallic aftertaste on the tongue. Yet no sign of occupancy, no fire in the grates, no food in the larder, no footprints on the marble hall. Only in the library, a single volume left open on the reading desk, a first edition of Thomas Brown S. Hyde, its margins filled with annotations not in Alistair S. hand but in a script so minute and precise it resembled engraving more than writing, detailing rituals involving the inversion of breath, the binding of names in salt, and the 7th hour of the 7th day, when the veil is thinnest. The book was later recovered by the British Museum, though the annotations vanished within a fortnight, as if the ink had dissolved into the paper itself. Rumors at first contained to the local alehouse soon spread through the columns of lesser newspapers. Whispers of a society within society, men and women of peerage and privilege who met not in the salons of Belgravia, but in the crypts beneath shuttered churches or the mirrored rooms of townhouses whose addresses changed with the season. These whispers spoke of vows taken not in blood but in silence, of oaths sealed not with signatures but with the deliberate erasure of one's own shadow from photographic plates. Alistair Wellingham's name was never formally linked to such circles. No indictment, no scandal in the broadsheets, but his sudden withdrawal from public life, his peculiar imports, the unnatural hush that settled over his estate, all suggested a man not merely retreating from the world but preparing for an audience far older and more exacting than any London drawing-room could provide. And yet, for all the strangeness surrounding him, there remained something profoundly human in his solitude. The way his study window, when lit, always showed the same arrangement of objects: a porcelain cup half filled with cold tea, a pair of spectacles resting on an open ledger, a single white gardenia in a slender vase. These details, preserved in the testimony of a boy who delivered coal until the winter of '87, suggest not madness but meticulous preparation. as though Alistair Wellingham were not hiding from the world but waiting for it to catch up to see what he had already seen in the spaces between breaths, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the fog that pressed against his windows like a petitioner at the gate. In the years following Alistair Wellingham's disappearance, though, disappearance is perhaps too theatrical a word for a man who simply ceased to be seen. Records of Blackthorn Manor grew increasingly spectral, populated not by persons but by traces. A ledger entry for 20 yards of black velvet, paid in silver threepences minted before the Regency. A receipt from a discreet apothecary in 7 Dials for essence of belladonna distilled under waning moon. A single calling card left on the hall table, embossed with a seal depicting a serpent coiled around a lyre, its eyes inlaid with what the housekeeper later described as glass that watched back. These fragments, preserved almost by accident in the solicitor's files of Messrs. Thorne and Pike of Chancery Lane, were not initially connected to any larger pattern. There were curiosities, anomalies filed under Wellingham Estate unsettled matters, alongside unpaid gardener wages and a disputed boundary with the neighboring Ashcombe lands. But curiosity, as the old proverb warns, is the first thread pulled from the tapestry of complacency. It was the diary of Miss Eleanor Vance, governess to the Ashcombe children from 1885 to 1889, that first lent coherence to the whispers. Miss Vance, a woman of strict Methodist upbringing and meticulous habits, kept a daily log not only of her pupils' progress in arithmetic and French but of observable irregularities in the natural order, a phrase she used with unironic gravity. Her entries from October 1887 note a peculiar stillness that would settle over the fields between Ashcombe and Blackthorn every Thursday night. Birds ceased their roosting calls, crickets fell silent, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. On one such evening, while walking the perimeter fence to retrieve a stray hoop, she observed a procession, though procession implies visibility, and what she saw was more the suggestion of movement within the fog, indistinct but rhythmic, like figures passing behind a frosted pane. She recorded hearing no footsteps, only the faintest resonance of a tuning fork struck once and allowed to decay into the damp air. More troubling was her account of the following morning, when she discovered the hoop not where it had rolled, but placed precisely at the center of the old stone circle along, believed to be a sheep dip but marked on Ordnance Survey maps as Druid's Rest. The wooden hoop was dry, though the ground was soaked with dew, and tied to its rim was a lock of hair blonde fine, and bound with a thread of silk dyed the color of dried blood. Miss Vance, though shaken, did not report the incident, fearing for her position. Instead, she tucked the hair into the lining of her Bible, where it remained until her death in 1912, when it was found by her niece and later donated to the Folklore Society, labeled simply Unidentified Relic Cerie. Meanwhile, correspondence between Alistair and a Dr. Lionel Herreby, formerly of the Royal College of Physicians, later disbarred for unorthodox methodologies, surfaced in a private collection auctioned in 1923. Their letters, written in a cipher alternating between Latin, Greek, and a phonetic script resembling shorthand, speak obliquely of the harmonic threshold, a state achievable only when 7 voices, unstained by grief, intone the name that is no name in the interval between midnight and the first crow. Herreby, in one decoded passage, warns Alistair that the resonance may awaken what slumbers beneath the city's bones, not in crypts, but in the spaces between walls, where time pools like stagnant water. He cautions against using the child's voice, though the context is redacted, and closes with a postscript that chills even now. Remember, silence is not absence, it is the vessel. This notion that silence could be shaped, filled, even inhabited recurs throughout the surviving documents. Alistair's library, catalogued after the estate was seized for back taxes in 1891, contained an unusual concentration of works on acoustics, sacred geometry, and medieval liturgy, but also obscure treatises such as De Vocibus Tessentabus Anonymous, Venice 1589, and The Doctrine of Echoic Memory by a certain Art Blackwood, a name absent from any university register. Many volumes bore marginalia in that same minuscule hand, noting frequencies, durations, and resonant hours correlated with lunar phases. More disturbing were the hand-drawn diagrams pasted into the end papers, concentric circles intersected by chords, annotated with symbols resembling musical notation but bearing no relation to any known clef or scale. One such diagram, recovered from a hollowed-out copy of Paradise Lost, was later examined by Professor Edgar Thorne of Cambridge, who concluded it represented not a map of space, but of sound over time specific, a waveform repeating at a frequency just below human hearing. He likened it to the ghost of a note that never fully sounded. Witnesses from the village, interviewed decades later by folklorists from Oxford, recalled how, in the winter of 1888, their clocks would stop at precisely 11:53 p.m., only to restart at 12:07 a.m., as if time itself had paused to listen. Milk curdled in pans without cause, mirrors fogged inexplicably, even in dry rooms, and when wiped, sometimes revealed faint tracing, numbers, or what one woman described as a mouth, open but not screaming. The local constable, a pragmatic man named Briggs, filed no official reports, but his private journal, kept in a ledger disguised as account books, notes a visit to Blackthorn in January 1888. He found the gate unlocked, the courtyard swept clean, and the front door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was warm despite the frost outside, and smelled of beeswax and something green and old, like stone under moss. He did not enter further, he wrote, because the silence had weight. It pressed on the eardrums like water, and from upstairs, not a sound, but the memory of one. He left within minutes, and never returned. Yet the most unnerving discovery came not from documents or testimony, but from an object, a small brass harmonium, found in the conservatory during the estate inventory. It was unremarkable in design, save for the fact that its reeds had been replaced with strips of human bone, thin, polished and tuned to intervals that defied Western scales. When a curious clerk attempted to play it, he reported not music, but a sensation as if the air were being pulled from his lungs in time with the bellows. The instrument was confiscated by the Metropolitan Police and later vanished from evidence. Storage under unexplained circumstances. All these fragments, letters, objects, silences might have remained mere footnotes in the annals of eccentric gentry had it not been for the journal of Reverend Arthur Pembroke, vicar of St. Etheldreda's from 1885 to 1893, a man of deep faith but sharper intellect. Pembroke began visiting Blackthorn in late 1887, ostensibly to offer spiritual counsel. His journal, now held in the Lambeth Palace Library, reveals a slow erosion of certainty. At first he attributes Alistair's behavior to melancholy of the nerves, but by March 1888, his entries grow hesitant, fragmented. He describes sitting with Alistair in the library for hours without a word exchanged, yet feeling as though I had been spoken to at great length. On his final visit, he writes, he showed me a room I do not recall entering. The walls were lined with mirrors, but my reflection was absent. In its place stood a figure in 17th century garb, weeping silently. When I turned to ask Wellingham what this meant, he was gone. The door behind me led not to the hall, but to the churchyard. It was snowing. The clock struck 13. Pembroke resigned his post 3 weeks later and died in an asylum in Kent, muttering of the choir that sings in the cracks of time. The investigation into Alistair Wellingham's affairs might have concluded with his estate's dissolution and the dispersal of his effects into auction houses and private cabinets of curiosity were it not for a series of coincidences so improbable that they began to resemble design. In the spring of 1892, a fire at the Chancery Lane offices of Messrs. Thorne and Pike destroyed much of the Wellingham file, but not before a junior clerk, one Edmund Carruthers, rescued a single folio containing correspondence between Alistair and a woman identified only as M. The letters, written on vellum so thin it was nearly translucent, spoke not of love nor conspiracy, but of the seventh harmonic and the necessity of absence. M urged caution, warning that the circle grows impatient. They mistake devotion for obedience. She signed each letter with a single stroke, a vertical line bisected by a smaller horizontal mark, resembling a tuning fork or, perhaps, a stylized gate. Carruthers, a man of literary pretensions and fragile health, became quietly obsessed, though he never published his findings. His private notebooks, preserved by his descendants and later examined by the Society for Psychical Research, reveal a meticulous cross-referencing of names, dates, and locations. He identified no fewer than 11 individuals who had visited Blackthorn between 1886 and 1888, all of whom vanished from public record shortly thereafter. Among them, Lady Isadora Vane, a noted patron of the arts, last seen departing a soirée in Belgravia. Dr. Herreby, whose laboratory in Bloomsbury was found empty save for a glass bowl filled with ash and 7 spoons arranged in a star. And most curiously, a young chorister from St. Paul's Cathedral, Thomas Bellwether, aged 14, whose voice, according to contemporary reviews, possessed an uncanny purity, as if unmediated by the body. Bellwether's disappearance was never solved, though a single sheet of music paper was found tucked into his locker, a setting of Psalm 22, altered to include a dissonant drone beneath the melody, notated in a hand matching Alistair's marginalia. Carruthers noted that all 11 vanished persons had one trait in common. They were described, in personal letters or newspaper accounts, as excellent listeners, not merely polite, but unnervingly attentive people who remembered silences as clearly as words. This observation, though seemingly trivial, led Carruthers to a theory he termed acoustic vampirism, the notion that certain individuals could draw sustenance not from blood, but from the resonant potential of another's voice, particularly when rendered in states of heightened emotion or ritualized utterance. He hypothesized that the Wellingham Circle did not sacrifice lives in the crude, sanguinary sense, but extracted something more elusive, the capacity to be heard, to leave an imprint upon the air. The horror then was not in death but in erasure, to speak and leave no echo, to exist without acoustic trace. This idea found eerie corroboration in the testimony of Mrs. Agnes Mallow, the Wellingham housekeeper, who, during a brief lucid interval in 1890 at the Surrey County Infirmary, whispered to a nurse that they don't take the body. They take the space the voice leaves behind. After they've finished, you can scream in a man's ear, and he'll hear nothing because his hearing has been repurposed. She then lapsed into a mutism from which she never recovered. Meanwhile, Carruthers uncovered property records, indicating that Alistair had quietly acquired leases on 3 subterranean chambers beneath derelict churches in Southwark, Clerkenwell, and Whitechapel locations chosen. Carruthers deduced, not for secrecy, but for their unique acoustic properties. Old church crypts, built with vaulted stone and layered with centuries of whispered prayer, acted as natural resonators. A single voice, properly placed, could be amplified, sustained, even fractured into harmonic overtones that lingered long after the source had ceased. In one such chamber, beneath St. Dunstan in Vist, investigators in 1893 found a circle of 7 chairs arranged around a central stone plinth. On the plinth rested a glass bell jar containing a single human tooth and a tuning fork calibrated to 432 Hz of frequency, then believed by esoteric circles to align with celestial harmony. The chairs were unmarked, but each bore a faint indentation, as if occupied regularly by figures of similar stature. More haunting was the residue on the stone floor, not ash or wax, but a fine dust that, when analyzed by a chemist at King's College, proved to be ground Bonavian and human intermingled, yet no bodies were ever found. The true turning point came with the discovery of the harmonic ledger, a bound account book hidden within a false panel in Blackthorn's wine cellar during a structural survey in 1894. Unlike financial records, it listed dates, times, and names alongside notations such as C minor, third inversion, voice of boy, clear timbre, and resonance achieved. 2 minutes 17 seconds. One entry for November 5, 1887. Guy Fawkes, Nitrides, all present. Bellwether sang the threshold chord. The veil thinned. M confirmed. The name was almost spoken, but the boy faltered. Silence reclaimed. The ledger ends abruptly in January 1888 with the words, "No more voices. Only listening now." Carruthers, by then bedridden with consumption, became convinced that the ritual had not failed but evolved. If voices could be harvested, then so too could silence, and perhaps silence, when concentrated, could become a medium for something older than language to pass through. He began experimenting with phonographs, recording ambient sounds from abandoned rooms and playing them back at altered speeds. In one such recording, made in his Bloomsbury flat, a faint whisper can be heard beneath the surface noise. He is waiting in the interval, though no one was present during the recording. The phonograph cylinder was later lost, but a transcript survives in the archives of the Ghost Club initialed EC and dated 3 days before his death. His last notebook entry, scrawled in a trembling hand, reads, "They were never summoning anything. They were tuning the world to hear what has always been speaking." Around this time, curious patterns emerged in London's meteorological records on nights when the fog was thickest over the Thames. Barometric pressure dropped inexplicably. In certain districts, always those where Wellingham associates had once lived, cats fled entire neighborhoods, pigeons refused to roost, and in the homes of the disappeared, clocks continued to stop at 11:53 p.m., as if time itself paused in reverence or dread. The Metropolitan Police, though officially dismissive, quietly assigned Inspector Harold Maitlander, man known for his discretion and interest in unusual phenomena, to review the case. His report, declassified only in 1956, concludes not with a theory, but a warning: do not investigate sound where there should be none. Do not answer when called by a voice that knows your name but not your face. And above all, do not listen too closely to silence. He recommended the file be sealed. It was, yet the echoes persisted not as events, but as absences. A missing chord in a symphony premiere. A gap in a telephone line where a voice should have been. The inexplicable hush that falls over a crowded room for no discernible reason. These were not anomalies, Carruthers believed, but residues, the sonic scars left by a ritual that sought not to invoke a god, but to become the ear of one. It was not until the winter of 1921 that the Wellingham affair resurfaced, not through official channels, but through the quiet obsession of Miss Rosamond Vale, an archivist at the London Library and the granddaughter of Edmund Carruthers. Rosamond had grown up amid her grandfather's notebooks, their margins filled with sketches of waveforms and fragments of ciphered script that she, as a child, had mistaken for musical notation. Trained in paleography and possessed of a scholar's patience, she began, almost as an act of filial piety, to reconstruct the scattered remnants of the Blackthorn dossier. Her work was not driven by belief in the supernatural, but by a historian's faith in pattern. If enough fragments aligned, truth would reveal itself not as revelation but as inevitability. She cross-referenced land deeds, shipping manifests, and society columns with the meticulousness of a watchmaker, and soon uncovered a thread previously overlooked: the role of the harmonic circle's patrons. These were not the usual suspects of penny dreadful occultism, but figures of unimpeachable standing: a high court judge, a director of the Bank of England, the widow of a celebrated admiral. None bore direct ties to Alistair Wellingham, yet each had suffered a quiet tragedy between 1888 and 1890. A daughter lost to nervous exhaustion, a son vanished during a grand tour, A husband found dead in his study with no cause of death and no note, only a phonograph cylinder spinning endlessly on the floor. Rosamond noted that all these individuals had, at some point, donated to the restoration of St. Dunstan in Eust, the very church beneath which the 7 chairs had been discovered. More significantly, she found that each had commissioned within a year of their loss a small brass plaque to be affixed to private chapels, or family mausoleums identical in design bearing only a single engraved symbol, the vertical line bisected by a horizontal stroke, the mark of M. Armed with this insight, Rosamond petitioned the Ecclesiastical Records Office for access to burial permits and memorial submissions from the period. There, in a water-stained ledger from 1889, she found an entry for a private interment at Kensal Green Cemetery. Remains of Emil Ashes interred in Vault 47B. No headstone, no service. The initials matched those of Marianne Lockwood, a celebrated soprano who had retired abruptly in 1886 after a performance at Covent Garden during which, according to newspaper accounts, her voice failed not in pitch but in presence, as though she sang from behind glass. Marianne had been Alistair's closest confidant in his youth, and rumored, though never confirmed, to be the M of the vellum letters. Rosamond visited Vault 47B on a grey February afternoon. The entrance was unmarked, the iron door rusted shut, but a groundskeeper whose grandfather had worked the cemetery in the 1890s recalled that one is always cold, even in summer, and if you press your ear to the stone, you hear breathing, not yours. Rosamond did not press her ear to the stone, but she did photograph the vault's exterior. When the plate was developed, a faint smudge appeared near the lock knot, a reflection, but a shape resembling an open mouth. She showed the image to Dr. Lionel Graves, a physicist at Imperial College researching acoustics and resonance. Graves, initially skeptical, grew intrigued when Rosamond played him Carruthers' surviving phonograph notes. Using a newly developed oscillograph, he analyzed the waveform of the whisper. He is waiting in the interval and found that its harmonic structure matched no known human vocalization. It's as if, he wrote in his report, the voice is being filtered through a medium that exists slightly out of phase with our own. Encouraged, Rosamond turned her attention to the harmonic ledger, now housed in the British Museum's restricted collection. With special permission, she was allowed to study it under supervision. What she discovered was not merely a record of rituals, but a coded map. The dates corresponded not to calendar days, but to astronomical alignment, specifically when certain stars formed configurations that, in medieval cosmology, were believed to open auditory portals between spheres. The entries mentioning resonance achieved always coincided with such alignments. More crucially, she noticed that the ledger's final pages, though blank to the naked eye, bore indentations, ghost impressions from a previous page that had been removed. Using oblique lighting and a technique borrowed from forensic document examination, she reconstructed the missing text. It was a list of names, 23 in total, each followed by a date and a single word. Donor among them, Marianne Lockwood, Thomas Bellwether, Lady Isadora Vane, and at the bottom, in Alistair's hand, a Wellingham donor. Silence. The word donor chilled her. It implied not victimhood but consent. These individuals had not been taken, they had given something intangible, yet essential. Rosamond began to suspect that the ritual was not about summoning but about tuning. The human voice, especially one trained in purity and emotional clarity, could be used to calibrate the fabric of reality itself, opening a channel through which something ancient and attentive might listen. And once it began listening, it required maintenance, fresh voices, fresh silences, fresh acts of willing surrender. Her research consumed her. She ceased attending social functions, declined academic appointments, and spent nights in the library stacks surrounded by acoustical treatises and ecclesiastical records. Colleagues noted a change in her demeanor. She spoke less, listened more, and when she did speak, her voice carried an unnatural evenness, as though she were measuring each syllable for resonance. In her private journal, now held in the Wellcome Library, she wrote, "We assume the dead are silent. But what if silence is the condition of their presence? What if they are not gone, but listening from the other side of sound?" She began experimenting with resonant frequencies in her Bloomsbury flat, using tuning forks, wine glasses, and a small harmonium inherited from her grandfather. Neighbors reported hearing music without melody, late at night, tones that seemed to vibrate in the bones rather than the ears. On the night of March 12, 1922, the anniversary of Alistair's last known sighting, Rosamond placed 7 tuning forks on a velvet cloth, each calibrated to a frequency noted in the harmonic ledger. She struck them in sequence, then sat in the center of the room and recorded the decay of their tones on a new electric phonograph. When she played the recording back, she heard, beneath the fading harmonics, a voice not speaking words but sustaining a single, pure vowel that lasted far longer than human lungs could manage. The next morning, her flat was found empty. The phonograph was still running, the needle tracing silent grooves on a blank disc. On her desk lay an open notebook. The final entry read, "It answers not in words, but in absence. I understand now. They didn't leave. They became the silence between notes." The police filed her disappearance as probable suicide, though no body was ever found. But a curious footnote appears in the library's internal log. On the day she vanished, a book on medieval acoustics checked out and her name was returned to its shelf. The volume was dry, yet the pages smelled faintly of river fog and beeswax, and when opened to the chapter on echoic memory in sacred spaces, a single line had been underlined in pencil, though Rosamond never used pencil. The most potent prayer is the one that is never spoken but held in the breath of the listener. The truth, when it finally emerged, did so not with a revelation, but with a sigh, a kind of quiet exhale that follows long-held breath, as if the world itself had been waiting to speak. It came not from documents or diaries, but from a single artifact recovered in 1934, during the renovation of a derelict townhouse off Berkeley Square, once leased under a false name but traced through watermarks on discarded envelopes to a solicitor known to represent Alistair Wellingham. Behind a false panel in what had been a music room, its walls lined not with books but with layers of felt and cork to absorb all sound, workmen found a sealed lead box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a wax cylinder of the kind used in early phonographs, its surface etched with symbols matching those in Alistair's marginalia. The cylinder was delivered to the British Museum, where it remained unplayed for months, deemed too fragile. But in the autumn of that year, a young technician named Henry Price, whose grandfather had served as groundskeeper at Blackthorn, persuaded his superiors to attempt reproduction using a specially calibrated stylus. What emerged from the horn was not speech, nor song, but silence, thick, textured, deliberate. At first, listeners heard nothing but the hiss of the medium, yet after several repetitions, a peculiar phenomenon occurred. Those present began to recall sounds that had never been recorded, distant bells, a child humming the rustle of silk, but not as memories, rather as intrusions, as though the silence on the cylinder were porous, allowing echoes from elsewhere to seep through. Dr. Graves, now retired but consulted due to his prior work with Rosamond Vale, listened 3 times in succession. On the third, he removed his spectacles, rubbed his temples, and murmured, "It's not a recording, it's a vessel." They didn't capture sound, they captured the absence that makes sound. Possible analysis revealed that the wax had been mixed with bone, ash, and river clay from the Thames near Blackfriars, a location historically associated with plague pits and unmarked burials. More tellingly, the cylinder's grooves followed no known modulation pattern. Instead, they formed a logarithmic spiral corresponding to the golden ratio, a shape long associated with acoustic perfection, but also, in esoteric tradition, with the architecture of the soul. The final clue came not from science, but from liturgy. A retired canon of Westminster, reviewing the harmonic ledger at Graves' request, recognized the structure of the threshold chord not as musical invention, but as a corrupted form of the canon perpetuus, a medieval compositional technique in which voices enter at staggered intervals and never resolve a metaphor. In monastic teaching, for eternal waiting, in its orthodox form, the canon was used in vigils for the departed, a way of keeping the soul company in the liminal space between death and judgment. But the Wellingham Circle had inverted its purpose. Instead of accompanying the dead, they sought to invite something else into that space, something that did not sleep, but listened. The vow, then, was not of blood, but of attention. Each donor had offered not their life, but their capacity to be heard, thereby creating a reservoir of pure silence, a negative space into which an ancient attentiveness might flow. Marianne Lockwood's retirement, Thomas Bellwether's disappearance, Alistair's retreat, all were acts of consecration. They had not been taken. They had stepped into the interval between notes and remained there, becoming part of the silence that allows the world to be heard. And in doing so, they had tuned reality to a frequency older than language, where presence is measured not by sound, but by the quality of the quiet that surrounds it. This cylinder was never played again. It rests now in a climate-controlled vault beneath the British Library, catalogued under unattributed acoustic artifacts, late Victorian, but those who have handled it speak of a strange sensation and impression, upon closing one's eyes, of standing in a vast high-ceilinged room where the air is perfectly still, and every breath feels like an interruption. There are no rites to undo what was done at Blackthorn, no exorcism, no reversal. The ritual, if it can be called that, was not an act, but a state, one that continues, subtly, in the fog-bound alleys of London, in the hush that falls over a room when a clock chimes the wrong hour, in the moment between a question and its answer when something other than thought seems to lean in. The elite did not gather to worship darkness, but to refine silence into a form of devotion. And in that devotion, they succeeded, not by summoning a god, but by making the world listen as they themselves had listened with total self-erasing attention. Today, Blackthorn Manor stands roofless and vine-choked, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets, yet still it draws the curious urban explorers with lanterns, historians with notebooks, the occasional poet seeking atmosphere. None stay long. They speak of a cold that clings not to the skin but to the voice, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something resting just beneath the surface of sound. The locals avoid the place after dusk, not out of fear of ghosts, but out of a deeper, older instinct, the knowledge that some silences are not empty, but occupied. And on certain nights always, when the fog rolls thick off the river and wraps the Surrey hills in its grey, embrace a sound may be heard by those passing too near the gate. Not music, not whispering, but the soft, rhythmic inhalation of someone or something listening with infinite patience. It is the sound of a vow kept across centuries. A voice is given not to be remembered, but to be missed. And if one stands very still, just beyond the ironwork, and holds one's breath until the pulse in the temple stills, one might feel it, not a presence, but an absence, so complete it has weight, shape, intention. The silence does not threaten, it waits, and in that waiting, it remembers every note that was ever offered to it, every name that was ever surrendered, every soul that chose to become the space between sounds rather than the sound itself. There is no warning to be issued, no lesson to be drawn, only the quiet understanding, settling like dust on the skin, that some doors, once opened by listening, can never be closed by speaking. And so the fog endures, patient and soft, curling around the ruins of Blackthorn as it curls around the spires of London, carrying within its folds not screams, but the echo of a single, unanswered question posed not in words, but in the breath held just before a name is spoken.